Hello and welcome to today's lesson. I'm your hard-working but indefatigable teacher, Mr. Burton. You will need to watch this video and take notes as you go. You may need to watch certain parts of the video a few times to ensure complete understanding. This is your homework and I will check your notes tomorrow before we get started. I hope you learned something.
Okay, hello and welcome to today's lesson. Moving on from a short run aggregate supply and aggregate demand equilibrium, we move to the long run this time. Right, in the long run aggregate supply curve becomes the level of output associated with full employment. The total quantity of resources, our factors of production and the productivity of these resources in the economy determines the position of the long run aggregate supply curve. Right, nothing new here. We've learned this before. We've been here just a few lessons ago. And the long run aggregate supplies will determine the long run real output. So that's real GDP and national income. The price level does not affect long run aggregate supply curve. So in this model, output, real GDP, is independent of the price level, and this is the reason why LRAS is perfectly inelastic, vertical, straight up and down. As prices in an economy increase or decrease, there's no change in the real output of that economy. An essential statement here: increasing the productivity of labour increases national output using the same level of resources. If the number of workers increases, so we get demographic changes, more people coming into the workforce, or increased immigration, for example, then the full level employment of output increases due to the increasing amounts of the factors of production. So in this case, in each case, long run aggregate supply increases and the long run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. But we know all that. We've been here. Let's have a look at changes in the equilibrium. So last time we put our short run aggregate supply curve together with our aggregate demand curve, and that determined the real GDP, national income and output, and it determined the price level. Now here in this model here, we introduce the long run aggregate supply curve in conjunction with the short run curves. So the economy is initially at the long run equilibrium level of output, which we know occurs at P1 at YF being the full employment resources. And at this point, aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply, which in turn equals long run aggregate supply. So we have a situation at point 1 here. We can see on our model where aggregate demand equals our short run aggregate supply, which equals our long run aggregate supply. The economy is producing at the full employment level of output. And we know from last time that any changes in the AD or short run aggregate supply curve, any change in determinants of aggregate demand causes a change in the price level, and economic output automatically returns to full employment level of output. So that's very, very important, and that's what distinguishes what occurs in an economy in the long run. The economic output will automatically return to the full employment level of output. So this is a long run equilibrium. Long run equilibrium here at point 1, where short run aggregate supply equals aggregate demand equals the long run aggregate supply. Any deviation from this will result in the economy returning to the full employment level of output at YF in the long run. Let's take, for example, one that we've a different example this time to one that we've looked at previously. So this time we've got an increase in aggregate demand, and this is occurring because the exchange rate is appreciating. That's making exports relatively less profitable and imports relatively inexpensive. This will decrease aggregate demand, because we got exports decreasing and at the same time imports increasing. When this occurs, we get a shift in the aggregate demand curve. The following sequence of events will occur. And we know there will be a decrease in aggregate demand. So AD shifts from AD1 to AD2. From the initial equilibrium where AD1 equals short run aggregate supply 1, which equals long run aggregate supply, our aggregate demand decreases. It shifts downward to the left to aggregate demand 2. With a decrease in aggregate demand, we get a new price level and a new level of national income and output. So this decreases. It used to be YF, the full employment level of output. That decreases to Y1. Price level falls from PL1 to PL2, and as average prices in the economy fall, so too does the value of expenditure on goods and services that are being produced in the economy. Firms are being faced with reduced profitability, and as a result of this, they reduce the supply of goods and services they produce, and it's shown as a downward movement along the SRAS1 curve from point 1 to point 2, as shown here with this green arrow. So from 1 to 2, a downward movement along the short run aggregate supply curve. However, we're talking long run, so short run, so our aggregate supply has a chance to react. From point 1 to point 2, and now we go from point 2 to point 3. At point 2 in the figure above, where average prices in the economy are at P2 and national output is Y1, the economy is producing below the full level employment level of output, and this level of output is short-lived as the prices of the factors of production fall, and as soon as that happens, firms' cost of production begin to decrease again on average. So with increased profitability, firms begin to increase output again. So output increases back to YF, the full employment level of output. And this is shown as a downward movement along the second aggregate demand curve from point 2 to point 3. As the supply of firms increases on average, then short run aggregate supply increases from short run aggregate supply 1 to short run aggregate supply 2. And the economy is automatically returning to its long run equilibrium of full employment level of output, which we know is at YF. And this occurs following any change in a determinant of aggregate demand. Finally, as firms increase their output, they have to reduce their prices to sell additional units of output and increase the quantity demanded by those in the market for their goods and services. And as a result, prices for resources decrease. Firms that are in competitive markets will be passing these cost savings on. Competitive pressures, price competition between firms mean that these cost savings will be passed on to those in the market for goods and services. Now on average, again, prices are going to fall and the price level decreases further from P2 to P3. Remember, it had previously decreased from P1 to PL2 as we shifted from point 1 on our model to point 2. Okay, let's take a look at another example here, another change in equilibrium, another brief change in equilibrium before the long run equilibrium is restored at YF. So again, here we have the economy at starting point 1, everything's in balance, aggregate demand equals short run aggregate supply, which in turn equals the long run aggregate supply. Now we know that any change in one of the determinants of aggregate demand or possibly aggregate supply is going to cause a change in equilibrium. Here we're focusing on aggregate demand again, and any change in aggregate demand causes a change in the price level. Change in the price level, and the change in the price level causes economic output, we're talking real GDP, to automatically return to the full employment level of output. That's YF. And again, this is in the long run, a long run. We're looking at a similar process here to an increase in aggregate demand, and we'll look at this instance where the exchange rate is depreciating, not appreciating like we looked at last time. So when the exchange rate depreciates, exports become relatively more profitable for firms to produce, and imports relatively more expensive for those in the market for imports to purchase, whether that be consumers or firms for the capital purchases or government expenditure. So as exports increase and imports decrease, we get an increase in aggregate demand. And as soon as we get an increase in aggregate demand, the following sequence of events occur, and they flow like clockwork. It's tick, 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 back to equilibrium. Aggregate demand increases from 81 to 82. We get an increase in the level of output. It's short-lived, but we'll get to that in a second. And we get an increase in the price level. So aggregate, an increase in aggregate demand increases YF to Y1, and we'll get a jump in the price level as well from PL1 to PL2. This results in a shift along and up the short-run aggregate supply curve from point 1 to point 2, and then an automatic shift from point 2 to point 3 along the second aggregate demand curve that we have here. What's happening here step by step? We've got a nice little flow chart for you here. Looking at our model and following through with our sequence of events here. So the economy is going to start at point 1, and this is a full employment level of output, YF. Aggregate demand increases, and as that happens, 81 shifts right to 82. The price level increases from P1 to P2 as the value of expenditure increases. Increased prices lead to increased profits, and firms increase the supply of goods and services. So the output increases to Y1 along the SRAS curve from 1 to 2. Next, at this point here, Y1 is greater than the full employment level of output, YF. Actual output is greater than the full employment level of output. There are no surplus factors of production. The economy is short. The supply of the factors of production are scarce. So firms are going to compete to secure very scarce factors of production now at Y1. There's a high level of output, remember. Firms are going to compete to secure the very scarce factors of production, and this is going to drive up resource prices. And as this happens, the cost of factors of production increase. Cost of production increases, profits decrease. Firms reduce output, and the short-run aggregate supply decreases from short-run aggregate supply 1 to short-run aggregate supply 2. We show that with a movement there to the left. The increase in average prices causes expenditure to decrease. Expenditure by those purchasing goods and services in the economy. And this is shown as a movement from point 2 to point 3 along the AD curve. Real output automatically returns to the long run equilibrium at the full employment level of output. So from Y1 to YF, it shifts backwards, returns to the long run equilibrium. As supply decreases, firms will increase their prices to maintain profits, and the price level increases from P2 to P3. So we have an initial jump in the price level from PL1 to PL2, and then at the later stages in our sequence of events, we get another bump in the price level from PL2 to PL3. Right. A lot of things to remember with your modeling here, and there are a whole sequence of events which you should practice and learn. It's straightforward, but it takes work, it takes practice, and you need to put in the time to be able to remember it.